Hey guys. So many of you probably know and maybe have seen, it's pretty long, have seen Vegan Gains' response to Kalel's video that I responded to, and also my response to Kalel's video on veganism and kind of purity vegans and the definition of vegan. That's mostly what I talked about in my video. So I'm skipping over a huge chunk of the video, basically the first almost 20 minutes, 17 minutes or so, because it's mostly just ad hom and also just misunderstanding my video and Kalel's video to a large degree when it comes to the definition of vegan. If you've seen my video, I'm pretty explicitly criticizing this rigid definition of veganism. But the thing is, even if you don't do those things, let's say you don't drive a car, let's say you don't take any sort of medication or anything, you still aren't vegan. None of us can truly be vegan.
Okay, so you're too fucking stupid to actually understand the definition of veganism. Reducing unnecessary suffering, death, and exploitation as much as reasonably possible. Nobody can do that?
But the thing is, even if you don't do those things, let's say you don't drive a car, let's say you don't take any sort of medication or anything, you still aren't vegan. None of us can truly be vegan. Because essentially, if you boil down all the points that Kalel makes, her definition, if you boil it down into just a one sentence definition, in order to be vegan, you cannot use any animal or harm any animal, period. And so I think you see where I'm going with this. No one is actually vegan when going by this definition. You can't possibly be. The only way you could be, you'd have to be dead. There's no way you can live without causing some amount of animal harm. It's just impossible. And this is why many vegans like myself, and really all vegans, we don't really use this rigid definition. We may portray it that way, but in our own lives, if you consider yourself vegan, you're not actually going by that definition. But there is a way to define veganism that makes sense and is actually doable, actually achievable without killing yourself. Please don't do that. And I think the best one is the one that comes from Vegan Society. Veganism is a way of living which seeks to exclude, as far as is possible and practicable, all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, or any other purpose. So as far as is possible and practicable is the important part there, right? It's not practicable to expect people to give up electricity to go vegan. And it's not possible to not eat. Richard, I guess, I don't know if he didn't watch the video well enough, or, it seems like he's just watching these videos and responding to them, which probably isn't the best way to do things. Obviously, it's fine when it's I don't know, you're reacting to a movie trailer or something, but when you're actually trying to, I don't know, think critically and respond appropriately, it's probably not the best thing to just respond as you're watching, especially if you don't like the person, which I get the feeling Richard is not my biggest fan.
Unnatural vegan is a fucking retarded inbred piece of trash.
So yeah, I was pretty clearly expressing my disdain for this sort of way of describing veganism. This, anyone who takes medicine isn't vegan, right? And to be fair, Kalel did clarify in a comment on my video that she does not like that either. That, quote, her video was preaching the contrary, that we need to ditch the rigid definition if we want to propel the movement forward into the mainstream. So for this video, what I want to talk about is something that I have criticized Vegan Gains for in the past. It's his arbitrary distinction between animal products and non-animal products that also cause harm. So in this case, palm oil. So he finally defends it. He finally defends this distinction that he draws and that many vegans draw, to be fair. And he does it by essentially calling any criticism of it fallacious. Specifically, he calls it the guilt by economic association fallacy. And also, the label of vegan can be really limiting. A good example would be palm oil, which Kalel actually brings up briefly.
And yeah, it has a half teaspoon of milk in it. Actually, side note, I'm more concerned about the palm oil in those candy bars than I am the milk. I think that's causing more destruction.
Okay, so Kalel started by making a series of appeal to futility fallacies, and the argument she made there was very similar to an appeal to futility, but it's slightly different. It's what I'd call a guilt by economic association fallacy. And the idea behind this fallacy is that If you make an economic transaction and somewhere along that transaction, so say somewhere along the development of a product or the supply chain of a product, if suffering or death occurs during the production or in the supply chain of that product and you made an economic transaction relating to that product, you are therefore responsible for that suffering or death that occurred. And she used palm oil as an example. So for those of you who don't know, palm oil production has quite a lot of controversy lately because with palm oil production, they're displacing and just shooting and killing a lot of orangutans to produce the palm oil. Well, she's saying if you buy palm oil, you are therefore responsible for shooting and killing orangutans. Well, this is kind of a nonsense argument, and it makes it a lot more clear if you put this in a human context. Are you guilty of mass murder and war crimes if you pay for taxes? Some of your portion of taxes goes towards military spending, and the military does inevitably end up murdering civilians, and like especially the US, they just go to war for no justifiable reason. So because you made an economic transaction that relates to war crimes in another country, does that make you guilty of war crimes? No. So the thing that's missing here is intent. When you buy a dairy product, the intent behind dairy production is to rape cows, exploit them for their milk production, and then murder them when they're of no use to you. That is an inevitable consequence of dairy production. It's what's intended in the dairy industry. Now, palm oil production, you don't actually intend. You don't intend to murder orangutans, and it's not a necessary consequence of palm oil production. You don't intend for war crimes to be committed in another country when you pay for taxes.
So guilt by economic association fallacy is not, it's not a fallacy. There is a guilt by association fallacy, but this has to do with inductive correlations, not causation. So like someone says to you, oh, well, you're friends with this bad person, so you're bad too. Right? Obviously, that's not necessarily true, which makes it a fallacy. But this is not at all what's going on when someone, for instance, buys palm oil. When your economic transaction is causing something, as it does in economics, then it's not just an association anymore. Buying palm oil directly supports the palm oil industry, which has a negative impact on the environment, on other animals. Of course, there are philosophical arguments against kind of defining morality in this way, where you're defining actions as good or bad based on consequences. There are ethical systems that ignore consequences and that focus on intention, but these pose some pretty obvious practical problems. If intent is all that makes something moral, then pretty much every action in history has been moral. Pretty much every person in history has been moral. Both sides of every war, every tyrant, because most people believe that they are doing the right thing. And this goes for everyone involved in the consumption of meat too, from consumers themselves to farmers, all the way up to the CEO of Purdue. Isn't that a chicken company? The vast majority of these people just intend to consume/produce meat. They don't actually want to harm animals. So viewing their actions in this way, just looking at intent, it makes discussing morality at all pretty much meaningless. What is the point of criticizing any action? What is the point of trying to make the world a better place if the only thing that matters is intent, which you can't even prove? I mean, anyone, even a psychopath, can say that their intent is good. The only potentially valid argument that Richard makes in this video has to do with necessity.
And then murder them when they're of no use to you. That is an inevitable consequence of dairy production, and it's not a necessary consequence of palm oil production.
If item A is almost impossible to make without harming others, and item B is easily made without harming others, it can be preferable to choose item B over item A, even in cases where they cause the same amount of harm, because this sets a precedent and it establishes a habit that's easier to change to reduce harm. Basically, there's an easier path to improving the situation. So an example of this today would be buying an electric car. Even though your electric grid may be powered by coal and battery recycling is in its infancy, buying electric now makes it easier to run cars on non-polluting energy in the future, and it encourages recycling improvements. But this isn't the argument that Richard is making. His notion of necessity is a fundamental one. You know, imagining that animal cruelty is the point of producing animal products while not the point of something like palm oil. It's essentially an extension of his argument about intent, that intention matters and not consequences.
Again, this does end up becoming an appeal to futility fallacy because you're saying, oh, well, everything I do, every economic transaction I make is going to support cruelty. Well, the thing you're missing here is intent. Not every economic transaction you make is intended to support suffering and death, and there are clearly economic transactions that you can make that are more ethical.
So that's not an appeal to futility. Appeal to futility is essentially somebody saying that if you can't be perfect, why bother? Why bother doing anything at all? I think many of us, if you're vegan, vegetarian, if you've just ever tried to do something good, you've probably heard that before. I feel like somebody recently I responded to who was vegan and then decided not to be. I feel like that was their big argument that like, well, there's lots of suffering and I can't stop it, so fuck it. But again, what we're talking about here is not appeal to futility. Questioning the difference in harm between something like dairy and palm oil is about consistency. Being consistent when distinguishing between actions that cause a small amount of harm and are therefore permissible, and actions that cause a great deal of harm and should be avoided. So I don't know which is more harmful, palm oil or dairy. That's an empirical question. You'd have to do like a comparative study on it. I guess that dairy is more harmful, but it could go the other way. That wouldn't surprise me. The point is that, number one, palm oil is incredibly harmful, and number two, if it is more harmful than dairy, then it doesn't necessarily make sense to be critical of people who are consuming dairy when you're still consuming palm oil. I think it's a shame that someone who eats a vegan diet, avoids palm oil, but let's say they buy, like, I don't know, Maybelline foundation or something every few months, or they buy a pair of leather shoes every few years. They can't call themselves vegan. But someone who eats a vegan diet, buys completely cruelty-free vegan makeup, no leather shoes, nothing like that, but they eat like Earth Balance every single day, they can call themselves vegan.
Okay, so this is the same guilt by economic association fallacy. I don't know why she's doing this. It's probably because she's an inbred retard, but she's just going along with Kalel's fallacies. So again, the issue here is the same. Yes, if you buy leather shoes, like even if it's only once every few years, you can't call yourself vegan because you are directly supporting the suffering and death of animals. When you make that economic transaction, you are paying someone to breed cows, murder those cows, and cut their skin off. When you buy palm oil from something like Earth Balance, you're not paying for somebody to murder orangutans. You're paying someone to just produce the frickin' palm oil.
When you're buying leather, you're just paying somebody to produce leather. They could have gotten it from cows that died of natural causes, from cellular agriculture. They didn't. They chose to kill cows for it, but that's their problem, right? I mean, your intent was good. Your intent was to acquire leather from a humane source, from, again, like a cow that died naturally. That's all that matters. Look, virtually anything can conceivably be produced in an ethical way, even animal products, from like vegan harvested meat to, again, meat from animals that just died on their own, like roadkill or something, cellular agriculture. But obviously it doesn't matter how something could be produced. What matters is how it's actually being produced. What you are paying somebody to do is exactly what they're doing unless you're protesting that, right? It would be like me saying, well, clean meat is the future, and that's my intent, is to buy meat that has no animal suffering attached to it, right? So I'm going to go ahead and start consuming meat because that's my intention, and eventually we'll have clean meat. I mean, it's obviously absurd. By buying something, whether it's dairy, whether it's leather, whether it's palm oil, you are supporting the production of that product. Buying from Purdue is telling Purdue that, yeah, keep it up, keep doing what you're doing. It's not telling Purdue that, no, actually, I want clean meat. It's telling Purdue that, keep torturing those turkeys. I love it.
If you pay your taxes, does that make you guilty of war crimes in a different country? Are you a mass murderer because you pay your taxes, because a portion of those taxes goes towards military spending?
No, because taxes are not optional. Just ask Blade. Depending on your views on how you see things, that might make Wesley Snipes a hero, but by no means does this make ordinary citizens guilty of war crimes, because taxes are not a choice. Now, you might be at least somewhat guilty of war crimes if you vote Republican, but not for avoiding hefty fines and even potentially jail by paying your taxes. Also, government is a pretty poor model for economic support because they will just keep doing things even if they don't have the budget for it. They'll just keep taking on more and more debt. Whether you approve of the deficit or not, you have to acknowledge that this is not normal business practice.
Are you going to claim that paying your taxes is the same as paying a hitman to murder a bunch of people? No, those are two completely different things, and the difference there is obviously intent.
Again, there are a bunch of differences that have nothing to do with intent. But is intent really morally important when the outcome is the same? Let's say that you buy milk with the intent that the cows live happy lives, right? That you're only taking the extra milk, right, and leaving some for the calves, and that the calf isn't taken from the mother and killed. That's nice, and honestly, I believe that that's what most people want. And I mean, a lot of people think that's what they're getting when they buy animal products. They think that they are buying humane dairy and humane milk, even though the reality is that the vast majority of animal products are produced in really, really cruel situations. Again, it's nice, but if the reality is completely different, your milk is coming from extremely cruel situations, just incredible amounts of suffering, how much does your intent really matter?
So intent matters. By making these guilt by economic association fallacies, you're just saying intent doesn't matter, and you're saying that all of these economic transactions are equivalent to each other.
So I guess as long as you send out positive, intentional vibrations into the world and you don't intend that any animals are harmed or killed via your purchasing habits, then you're totally innocent regardless of what happens. That's just ridiculous. Economic transactions are equivalent morally if they are equivalent in terms of harm and they are equally unnecessary. Assuming that you have the relevant information, what matters here is degree of necessity and degree of harm. Intent is really only meaningful if it's indicative of ignorance, right? If you just didn't know about the harm that your actions were causing, it doesn't change the fact that the actions were harmful. It doesn't make them any less harmful, but it does vindicate your character to some degree. Depends. Maybe I should expand on that a little bit. I think we've all done this. I'm not saying this is unique in any way or this makes someone uniquely a bad person, but I think there are times when we are intentionally ignorant. Maybe we know on some level that something might not be too cool and we just ignore it, right? It's like people who are like, oh, I can never watch Earthlings. That just looks terrible and make me sad and it would make me not want to eat certain things again. It's like, oh, okay, well, that doesn't really count, right? That doesn't really count as being truly ignorant. But anyway, if you do know about the harm, if you're not ignorant, if you know about the harm that your economic transaction, that your purchases are causing, and you keep doing it, you keep purchasing those products, you're responsible for that. In terms of the action itself, it doesn't matter that you don't like it. It doesn't matter that you wish it didn't happen. You're still supporting it. My point is that the second person is causing a lot more harm by consuming palm oil every day than the other person who's just buying leather a few times a year, and yet...
Yeah, again, you're totally removing the aspect of intent, and you're also just equating these things.
Notice that he doesn't actually disagree that the person who is consuming palm oil daily is causing more harm. He doesn't seem to care about harm. Again, he cares about this arbitrary animal versus non-animal ideological purity thing. He cares about intent, but he can't comprehend the fact that most meat eaters don't want to cause animal suffering, right? They want to buy meat either because they just like the way it tastes, or in some cases people actually believe that it is fundamentally necessary to eat it to be healthy. The suffering is an inevitable byproduct of that, just like with modern palm oil production. I don't think this is Richard's intent. I guess that's all that matters. But what he's really doing by focusing on intent and by ignoring harm is validating carnist apologetics.
And you're also just equating these things. So paying your taxes is equivalent to paying a hitman. Buying palm oil is equivalent to paying for animals to be murdered. These things aren't equivalent.
This is a very meaningful question of, how many lives per calorie we're talking about. And not all products are the same. Palm oil produces a huge amount of calories, probably a lot more than you'd get out of a cow per life taken. And so does dairy versus meat. So here's a good graphic from Animal Visuals where they're comparing some animal and plant products. I'd really be interested to see where palm oil falls on this chart. The point is that we're dealing with a gradation of harm, right, between animal and plant products. 99% of the time, animal products are going to be more harmful, right? Have a larger negative impact. But that may not always be the case. I think it's a big mistake to fall into this sort of black and white thinking that animal products bad, plants good, end of story. It's not rational, and it just makes us look like hypocrites and zealots when we criticize others. Being vegan is a good heuristic because 99% of the time, it's right. Right? Like cutting out animal products and eating more plants, 99% of the time is going to be better and cause less harm. But that doesn't mean that we can't or that we shouldn't work on going beyond veganism where we can. And it doesn't mean that we should be unfairly critical of non-vegans for following a different heuristic. Freegans, austro-vegans, invasivores, flexitarians, and other reducitarians, depending on the details of their lifestyles, it could go either way, and we can all do better. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. Comments and questions down below. Subscribe, that's cool. Support the channel, patreon.com/unnaturalvegan. And I will have a new video very soon. Just Ask Blade. I've seen that movie, so I haven't seen it recently. And I think that's good because I'm pretty sure it's atrocious. I'm pretty sure it's a terrible movie. But man, I watched it so many times as a kid. I loved it. I loved, what's his name? Stephen Dorff. Oh my God. Oh my God. I loved him. And like everyone in that movie, even the chubby comedic side character, like everyone in that movie, I was so attracted to. I just remember the end when they stab him with all the injections of the stuff. What even the fuck was it? The anti-vampire stuff. And he just gets all big and gross and explodes. And I'm sure it just looks terrible because when did this movie come out? Like 98 or something? Oh my God. I'm sure those effects are amazing.